In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I recovered from 10 years of depersonalization symptoms without ever taking any medication at all. Hi, welcome back to Mental Health Power. My name is Ramsey. So in this video, I'm going to show you not only exactly what depersonalization is, but how I recovered from this up to the point where I now experience maybe only 1% of the symptoms. So 99% of the symptoms are basically gone. So firstly, what is depersonalization? So this is a mental health issue that is not really as commonly spoken about compared to depression or anxiety. Depersonalization is essentially what is known as a dissociative disorder. Now, I'll explain later why I prefer not to use the word disorder, but for now, we can sum it up by saying that it has two sets of dissociative symptoms. The first set is all related to the experience of experiencing a detachment from the self, and the other symptoms, which are also known as derealization, are all related to a detachment from reality. So what I experienced, and somebody who has depersonalization has, I experienced both sets of symptoms, but some people who have depersonalization will maybe only experience some of the symptoms, so they may not experience, let's say, symptoms that are related to experiencing a detachment from reality. They may only experience the depersonalization aspect, which is detachment from the self. So what exactly are these symptoms and why are they so scary? So with depersonalization, which I'm just going to abbreviate, I'm going to just abbreviate derealization with DR and DP for depersonalization. So what I've got here are the sets of symptoms I experienced for 10 years. Initially they were extreme, and as the years went on they gradually got better in varying degrees depending on what was happening at the time. So with depersonalization, which refers to the detachment from the self, what I and other people who have depersonalization would have experienced is the feeling that your body is fake. So you literally have a detachment from the body that you have. So you get the experience and the sensation that it's not yours. You almost feel like you're a robot, almost, in a sense, like it's not really your body, like it's a fake body. Because of this, your emotions and your physical sensations don't feel like your own, so you feel somewhat numb in your emotions as well. Even your voice doesn't sound like your own. So what we can say is it feels like you have possessed someone else's body. This also means that when you look in the mirror, you don't actually feel an attachment for the reflection that you're seeing. It feels like you're looking at another person. And so with the derealization, which is the symptoms related to a detachment from reality, you experience life and your outer world like it's literally like a dream. So if you ever had what is known as a lucid dream, which is when you're dreaming and then you wake up in the dream and you realize, oh, I'm dreaming, okay, yeah, and then you can, do all kinds of things in the dream which are cool. But imagine if you couldn't wake up from that dream ever. So you were literally just living your life in that dream and you knew it was a dream because you can see it's a dream, but you couldn't wake up. That would be pretty scary, right? Well, the derealization aspect is that 24/7 where you're living your life, but visually and emotionally you experience it like it's a dream. It just doesn't seem real. So apart from it looking and feeling unreal, this also makes you eventually start feeling detached from it because it seems completely fake. People end up seeming fake as well. It's almost like you're in a game, like a virtual reality game, because your mind is literally perceiving it like it's not real. Specifically for me, I had two symptoms which are also spoken about as well. So what I used to have was seeing a three-dimensional haze, almost like an almost clear mist everywhere I went. Now, this also would be coupled with after images. So if you ever had the experience of staring at a light for a long time, or even just a minute, and then looking away and you still see like an inverted negative image of the light. Imagine that, but for everything you looked at. So if I looked at, when it was really bad, if I looked at a person or anything for, let's say, 20 seconds or more, maybe even less, and I immediately looked away, I would see an after image floating in the air of that, like it was there, and it would gradually fade away. But you can imagine having all of this going on, and then the 3D haze, and then having after images becomes insanely distracting. And you can imagine having this for years and years is basically downright terrifying. So because of this, there are other problems that actually affect you in many other ways. So for people who have either set of symptoms, the common experiences they have which stem from these are concentration problems. So because you have all of this stuff going on, understandably, it's going to be incredibly hard to concentrate. But it goes further than that, because you end up experiencing memory loss. So like, what used to happen is I could walk into a room, remember I need to do something, or somebody would say, oh, do this thing. I would then, a few seconds later, go to do that thing. By the time I got to the location, I would have completely forgotten the event, to the point where they would come back to say, hey, what happened to that thing you were going to do? I wouldn't even remember the conversation taking place. So like, it's memory loss to that extent, where entire memories, entire events that had just occurred, it was like they had been sliced out of reality, like they never happened. So because of that, then your perception of time is altered. So you experience altered time, where an hour feels like 5 minutes. Sometimes 5 minutes feels like an hour, and this changes throughout the day depending on your concentration level. And because of this, then you experience a loss of time, or what is known as missing time. So you can maybe go for a whole day doing just your everyday thing, and then you get to the end of the day and you're like, I actually have no idea what I did today. It's completely gone. Now, I know that some people may experience this, let's say if they've had a busy time, but if you literally cannot remember anything to the point where you're literally trying to remember and your brain has just got nothing there for a whole day, like it never happened, it only feeds the sense of things not being real. In addition to that, you end up losing a sense of purpose, because, well, you just can't live. Like the normal everyday things you normally would do, you just can't do anymore, because you can't remember things. Nothing seems real. Your body seems fake. You feel numb. You don't have really any emotions. Or what can happen is, because you don't have the emotions, because you feel numb, because you lose a loss of purpose, you just feel dead, even though you're alive. So you feel like a zombie. And this only adds then to things, because while you may at times feel emotionally numb, what then happens is all of this, because all the problems it creates with relationships, with work, with just doing everyday things, it creates high levels of anxiety constantly. So you end up shifting between having high levels of anxiety, and then because your body just runs out of the chemicals to create anxiety, you just end up going the complete other way, completely emotionally numb. And it just swings back and forth, basically, one to the other. So you can imagine, because of all this going on, because of the detachment from the body, because things seem fake, and because of concentration problems, it's really easy to be clumsy and to feel physical numbness as well. So, for example, I would not realize I was experiencing pain somewhere, and I could go on for very, very long periods, let's say in the cold, and I would technically feel the pain, but it wouldn't actually feel like it was my pain. So I would almost like ignore my body to the point where I would damage it. Some people may see that as an advantage, but it's really not. In the long run, it's not a good thing at all. And so all of this, as you can imagine, creates incredibly strange relationships, because if you can't remember things, if you start talking to somebody and then you forget what you're going to say, you can't really have a conversation. Or if you can't remember your relationship with that person completely, that also creates a problem. So this summarizes, generally speaking, what the experience of depersonalization is like. So I experienced this for 10 years. And what I'm going to do is to explain what I've discovered as the actual root causes of this from my own perspective, based on a specialist that I saw a long time ago, my own research, my own trial and error. And then I'm going to show you exactly how I recovered from this without needing to take any medication at all. So what exactly causes depersonalization then? So this first part I learned from the specialist that I saw when I was first diagnosed many years ago. And so what he explained was 95% of the patients that he had seen in his research had something in common. They had childhood trauma, divorced parents, and one of the parent was absent in the long run. So of course I noticed that that fit me perfectly. He also noticed that stress played a part in childhood as well, which yes, that also applied to me as well. So what does this mean? So he explained that his theory, and I think this is most likely true, was that everybody has what he called an anxiety threshold. So we can see this as the upper limit, how much pressure and stress a person can take. So the more stress that's added, the more pressure, then the higher the amount of anxiety will appear as well. So imagine this part of the graph shows the level of anxiety, and this part here shows the amount of pressure. So the more pressure that's applied, the more anxiety and stress is experienced. It's very normal. Eventually though, everyone will have a limit to exactly how much pressure they can handle, how much anxiety that their body and mind can take. And when you get to the beginnings of that limit, or you pass the limit, then you start seeing different psychological symptoms that shows that they've now gone past the limit and their mind and body is starting to struggle. So what he explained further was that for people who have had childhood trauma and lots of stress in their life, but specifically childhood trauma, he suggested that due to there being an absent parent, most likely the child grows up in an environment of uncertainty. So specifically emotional uncertainty, but there can also be other levels of uncertainty as well. But generally speaking, what this means is that the anxiety threshold is much, much lower. So for me, for example, it was probably down here or something like that. So much lower, which meant that my body and mind just could not handle normal amounts of pressure. So for most of my life, this threshold wasn't really broken until I started my first job, and that's then when I started to see all the symptoms appearing, which made sense because this was the first time that I actually had real pressure put on me. And there were other factors as well during my life at that time. So the anxiety threshold went way beyond. So my anxiety threshold was broken completely. And so that's why my mind then had to do something about it in order to survive, because the mind's main purpose, one of its main purposes, is for your own survival, right? So when this threshold is broken, when too much pressure is applied, the mind then will it will trigger the fight or flight response because it believes there must be a threat. If you're experiencing that much pressure and anxiety, it believes there must be something so threatening. So the fight or flight response normally kicks in if there is an actual predator or perceived threat. And this will then pump into your body the various chemicals like adrenaline, so that you can either fight the threat or run away to survive. But there can be situations where the mind cannot actually identify if there's a threat or if to run from or to fight. So in that situation, there's a third option for humans, which is to just detach, to disassociate from the situation completely. So when that happens, the idea is, this happens sometimes in people in like car accidents or in disaster situations, where their mind will detach so things seem more dreamlike, so they don't panic, so that they can calmly make decisions, so they can calmly escape. That makes sense in that situation. That's a very good survival mechanism of the mind. I'm sure that's worked for millions of years. Well, maybe not millions of years, but for a long time. So what happened for me was this mechanism of dissociation, of detachment, never switched off for about 10 years. And it's not meant to be switched on for that long. So all of the various symptoms ultimately stemmed from that fight or flight response not switching off. So this means that there was constantly a perceived threat all the time, non-stop. So what I noticed was, after working with another psychologist, she was very good, and she noticed that working together, we noticed that it wasn't just external things that these symptoms become stronger for. So let's say I went into a situation where there were lots of people who maybe would put attention on me. Then I would notice, all right, anxiety levels going up, and then the symptoms of depersonalization also go up. But we also noticed that even when there wasn't any technical external threat, whether physical or emotional threat, sometimes the symptoms would still be very strong. So what we realized was, it's not just external threats, but internal threats. And what are those? That's emotions and thoughts. So what it meant was, there were certain thoughts I was having, certain emotions I was having, that, especially with the emotions that were so strong, that my mind would start to disassociate even further from my body and from reality, because it perceived the emotions themselves, because they were so intense at times, it perceived those to be a threat. So if you do have depersonalization, that's something to think about. How do you feel? How do your symptoms react when you have certain intense negative emotions? Try and see if there is a connection to that, because for me there was definitely that. And so ultimately, the conclusion I've come to from learning all this, and from the various other research and experiences that I've had with depersonalization in my journey in recovering from it, is that I believe that at the very core, it stems from the mind perceiving unsafe relationships. But it's not just, let's say, people being seen as unsafe and potentially causing physical or emotional harm. It's also the world. So if the external world is seen as a threat because of multiple past experiences, all laid on top of each other and compounded on top of each other, which is why I experienced not just childhood stress and trauma, but also many other stressful experiences that stemmed from that, from living with a single parent, for example. So it's not just the external world that's seen as a threat, and so there's a need to detach and dissociate, but the self. So my mind was seeing my own emotions and my own thoughts as a threat. So that to me is why then there was not just the dissociation with reality, the derealization symptoms, but also the depersonalization symptoms. So what that means is, it's unsafe relationships with the world, with other people, and also with the self. So it was with myself. So that's something to think about if you do have depersonalization symptoms. So what should you do if you do have depersonalization? What can I recommend? So these are the main things that I did over the course of 10 years. There isn't necessarily an order to these, but I would say you should definitely start with this one, which is to accept that you have these symptoms. And I know that might sound a bit strange, but I say that because when we have those kind of symptoms, especially for such long periods of time, it's very easy to want to resist them and to pretend that they're not actually happening. But what we resist will persist. So if you're mentally trying to get away from it, it's only going to make it worse. The first thing you should do is to accept it as much as possible. And over time, the more you do this, you'll be able to accept that it's there 100%. So when I say accept, I don't mean to give up. I don't mean to stop looking for solutions. What I mean is to just accept what is, accept the reality of the situation. And what can help with that is to understand that although they call these things dissociative disorders, I wouldn't say that's necessarily a good way of putting it, because these are ultimately adaptations. So if it is the fight or flight response being triggered, this is your mind's way of surviving, and so therefore it's an adaptation. So I would really call it a dissociative adaptation. I think that's a lot more accurate. And so what this means is if you start referring to it in that way, you're automatically empowering yourself, because if you keep saying you have a disorder, I personally think that's disempowering. And if you keep saying it to yourself over and over and over again, this influences your subconscious mind and your self-image. And you'll see my previous videos on depression and anxiety where I talk about in a bit more detail as to how the subconscious mind works in that way. So you also want to look at your childhood, because it's highly likely that this actually started off in childhood with your anxiety threshold being lowered. So look to your childhood, look for stresses and traumas, but you also want to understand that trauma doesn't have to be something really obvious. It can be something a lot more subtle. So it's really look for what would be traumatic for a child, because a child will interpret the world and events differently. So as an example, a child getting lost in a supermarket for a few minutes could be very traumatizing. Or a child not having their emotions validated, that can be traumatizing, because then they don't know what the feeling within their body is that appears. And that brings me on to the next part, which is, from my experience, gaslighting and emotional invalidation plays a big part in influencing the symptoms of depersonalization. So why do I say that? So if you imagine that you have a long-term absent parent who then specifically already that's a form of invalidation to a child. But imagine if even after that, where there are problems where that parent continues to invalidate your emotions and your perception, can you see how that can link to depersonalization? And I also had many other experiences also with other people where they were expressing yourself that emotions were not validated or dismissed. So consider how that could affect your symptoms, how you see yourself in the world. Because what you're being told is the way you feel, the way you see things, the way you experience things is not really happening. So that's something to consider. So what that means is you want to validate your own emotions. So when you feel something, don't dismiss it. You want to feel it completely and understand where it's coming from. Try to see the emotions as a part of you. So what you can do is to mentally speak to your emotions. So you can soothe your emotions by talking to it like it's a younger version of yourself. So the more you feel the emotion, the more you speak to it, the more you learn what it's trying to say to you, because in a way emotions are like a language. The more you do this, the more you are creating a safe relationship with your emotions. So as I did this more and more and more over the years, I noticed that once a strong emotion would appear, by me being completely accepting of it, not resisting it, and feeling it completely, these symptoms of depersonalization stopped appearing eventually. So it does take practice, but the more and more you do this, the more you're creating a safe relationship with yourself. And of course, the next thing you want to do, generally speaking, is to reduce stress. So what I had to do was to quit my first job, because the job was just becoming too stressful for me, because the anxiety threshold just kept getting broken all the time. So look for ways where you can mentally, physically, emotionally, socially completely reduce as much stress as possible. So because this is such a varied topic, you'll have to look into ways that you can reduce stress. I can even do another video on that at a later date. The main things you want to do though are to observe your triggers. So is it just your emotions or thoughts that are triggering these symptoms, making it worse? Or is it certain people? Is it certain situations? So for example, if you're in a situation where you notice maybe you could be judged or there's the potential for rejection, Maybe you notice your symptoms become stronger during those periods. Or do you notice that it's during a particular time? Like, is it on your way to work, on your way back? If you keep a diary of your symptoms, of when they are strong or when they are weaker, do this for a couple of weeks, and you'll be surprised to see sometimes there is an actual pattern, and from that you can start to figure out what triggers it. So these will give you clues as to what your mind is perceiving as a threat. So you may find it's general, just people in general, which I guess makes it somewhat more difficult. But you may find it's a certain type of person due to past experiences. Your mind is now perceiving them to be an emotional or physical threat. So I observed that triggers would come for many different reasons, but ultimately it boiled down to this: the potential for unsafe relationships, so emotionally, psychologically, or physically unsafe relationships due to many past experiences. You also want to learn to observe your thoughts, because I also noticed that my thoughts themselves and past negative self-talk became so bad, and the emotions I had became so strong related to them, that they would trigger stronger symptoms of depersonalization. So you want to get into the habit as best as possible of observing your thoughts, especially when you notice the symptoms getting stronger. And as I said before, you want to feel your emotions. So when strong emotions arise, or any emotion arises, you want to feel it as much as possible and not resist it. The more you do this, the more you're training your mind to not see your emotions as a threat. The more you accept them, the more you are validating them as well. What can help with this is if you start going out of your comfort zone, because the more you do this, the more you'll be able to see your emotions being triggered, and the more you can figure out what is triggering the emotion, the quicker you can start to feel them, to retrain your mind that your emotions are safe. So sometimes, for example, I noticed that it wasn't necessarily a situation that was being seen as a threat, but the emotions I would feel from that situation. So what can help is identify what your comfort zone is, what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with, and start gradually going out of your comfort zone. And you'll start to notice very quickly what triggers the symptoms more, or what actually can reduce them, when you notice the contrast between going within and without of your comfort zone. What can help in feeling your emotions, observing your triggers, and also observing your thoughts is meditation. Because meditation will bring you back into the present moment, and depersonalization effectively takes you out of the present moment, because you are dissociating from what's happening right now. So, there are thousands of videos on YouTube and websites all about meditation. I'd highly recommend looking into mindfulness meditation and making a daily practice of that. This also links into breathing. So if you haven't seen my video on anxiety, I talk about how breathing is extremely effective at reducing anxiety, especially if you have anxiety in the present moment. By changing your breathing patterns, by slowing it down, making it more, having more longer and slower breaths, you gradually reduce anxiety levels in the moment, which I find reduces this fight or flight response quite a lot. And what you are telling your mind is that it's safe, that it doesn't need to panic. And at the core of a lot of this, of the unsafe relationships, is really self-trust and self-worth. Because if you can fully trust yourself, if you're able to fully trust yourself and to develop that, you're telling your mind that you are safe. So no matter what happens around you, you still have the ability to deal with it. So you need to look into different ways to build trust and to build your self-worth. So one of the things you can do is to keep consistently looking for evidence of safety. So if your mind is perceiving there to be threats all the time, and that's why it's dissociating, you need to do the opposite and to prove to it over and over again, multiple times, consistently, that you are safe. So let's say you go through a situation that triggers depersonalization symptoms and you come out of it perfectly fine, nothing happened, then you tell yourself, you see, look, everything was fine. And the more you do this, the more you look for evidence that your emotions are safe, again, through feeling them, or through going out of your comfort zone to prove to that part of your mind that you are safe, you are not only building self-trust, but you are constantly finding solid evidence of safety, which will continuously reduce the idea of there being an actual threat. And finally, what you need to do is to meet your needs. So by this, I mean your physical, emotional, and mental needs. So reducing stress is definitely going to help meet your mental needs. And your emotional needs, I guess, will also be learning how to feel and validate your emotions. But also you want to make sure you learn how to set healthy boundaries, because if your boundaries are violated, that is seen as a threat. So you need to learn how to set and maintain your boundaries. You also want to meet your dietary nutritional needs, and you want to be able to make sure you get proper sleep, because one of the common things I found was people with depersonalization, when they have poor sleep, massively affects the symptoms. And it makes sense, because if you're low on energy or your body is lacking in its nutritional resources, it's not going to feel safe enough to deal with the situation with life. So you definitely need to meet all your needs as best as possible. So thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.